Inside the morgue, the doctors were about to perform a final autopsy on the young boy who had just been pronounced dead. But in the next moment, the boy's body suddenly convulsed and he regained his vital signs. The doctors rushed him back to the emergency room. Almost everyone was stunned by the miraculous resurrection. But there was only one exception. She was the boy's mother, because for the boy's mother, this was not the first time this had happened. The boy's name was Louis. At just 9 years old, he had already had 8 encounters with death. The day he was born, the doctors needed to operate on his mother with a saw because he was in the wrong position. When Louis was 4 months old, a chandelier fell directly on him. All his ribs were broken. When Louis was just learning to crawl, he was electrocuted by sticking a fork into a socket. Louis was at someone else's house for dinner. Everyone else is fine, but he gets food poisoning, salmonella, tetanus, botulism, meningitis. He's had it all. Even spider bites and bee stings are nothing to Louis. Last winter, he was in respiratory arrest for 9 minutes due to non-stop screaming. If he was a cat with 9 lives, Louis is now down to his last life. And on his 9th birthday, Louis fell off a cliff on a picnic with his parents and suffered multiple fractures. Although he survived, he was still unconscious. Everyone thought it was a medical miracle, but in fact, there was a big secret hidden inside. How did 9-year-old Louis fall off a cliff for no reason at all? After the accident, Louis' father, Stephen, disappeared. The police initially concluded that Stephen had pushed his son off the cliff and then absconded. But as the investigation progressed, they found that they could not rule out the possibility that Louis had hurt himself to gain attention, because this boy was something else. According to Louis' psychiatrist, Louis was not only unlucky, he was also a typical problem child. He was a foul-mouthed child at a very young age. He didn't have a single friend at school. To avoid seeing a doctor, Louis would pretend to be claustrophobic. He would pee in the lift and deliberately rub himself against his mother. His psychiatrist also found that Louis had serious violent tendencies. He had had several hamsters before, but he had killed them in various ways. Because Louis thought he had the hamster, he should have the right to dispose of it. Things got a bit complicated, but as long as Louis was in a coma, it was difficult for them to know the truth. So the hospital called in Drive Allen, a specialist in childhood comas, to find out more. Allen talked regularly with Louis' mother, Natalie. According to her, the family had been having a nice picnic on Louis' birthday. But her husband, Stephen, suddenly got into a fight with her. Louis was so frightened that he went to the edge of the cliff alone. Stephen accidentally pushed Louis off the cliff, and he disappeared. Allen is convinced by Natalie's story. He believes that Louis' father, Stephen, is a dangerous man with a violent temper. But is this really the case? What happens next proves that this woman is not only beautiful, she is also a good liar. Natalie's husband has disappeared, and her son is in a coma with serious injuries. And after a brief moment of grief, she soon appears at a party talking to various men. This leaves Drive Allen on the sidelines a little depressed, but soon Natalie pretends to have a chance encounter with Drive Allen in the kitchen. The mood between them began to change. Allen has completely forgotten who he is. The next day, Natalie turned up at the hospital in a red dress. Allen noticed her immediately, right in front of Louis' bed. Natalie asks the doctor to go for a walk, talking about her unhappy marriage. Whenever a beautiful woman shows vulnerability, most men will be comforted by the sight of her. And when Allen had finished, he was thinking of what to say next. But to his surprise, Natalie came up to him, and that's when Natalie suddenly saw her son Louis, who had been in a coma for days, sitting up from his bed. The two of them rushed back to the ward. Louis seemed to have something to say. No sooner had they finished speaking than Louis fell unconscious again. And that night, something strange happened. Natalie called Allen into her home and claimed she had received a warning letter. The letter threatened Natalie to stay away from men, including Drive Allen, or else bad things would happen. Even more bizarrely, the letter was addressed to an unconscious Louis. The police analyzed the notes and identified them as Louis. How could he have written the letter while he was still in a coma? Everyone thought it must have been written by the missing Stephen, copying his son's notes. To keep Natalie safe, Allen arranged for her to be temporarily admitted to hospital, but before the matter could be investigated, Allen himself received another warning letter from Louis. The two letters were very similar. Again, Allen was told to stay away from his mother. Allen rechecked Louis' condition with the police officers. It was confirmed that he was in a vegetative state and was unlikely to wake up. It was even more unlikely that he would write a threatening letter. The officers had heard that Allen had recently become very close to Natalie. He reminded Allen that Louis was actually Natalie's son by someone else and not Steven's. Ellen is shocked because Natalie had told him that Steven was the only man she had ever known. This shows that this woman is a very skilled liar. Ellen decided to find Natalie and confront her. As soon as he reached the door, he came across Natalie coming out of the shower. Ellen tried to restrain himself from voicing his doubts. Natalie didn't answer right away. She said she needed to change her clothes. She told Ellen to turn around. Natalie then, still looking miserable, she said that she had given birth to Louis by accident. She was afraid to say anything because she was afraid that Ellen would look down on her. At that moment, the warm sun shone on Natalie's face. She looked beautiful and vulnerable. Ellen had lost his mind again. Yet again, Natalie had lied. The truth was that Louis had been taken to the emergency room as a baby. Instead of informing Louis' real father, Natalie called Steven, whom she had only recently met. A year later, Stefan married Natalie. Just then, an old woman comes to visit Louis in hospital. It turns out that she is Stefan's mother. The old woman, Natalie, argued as soon as they met, and she told Ellen that Steven loved Louis the most. Steven valued Louis' life more than his own. He would never do anything to hurt Louis. In the middle of the conversation, the police burst into the office with the sad news. Steven's body has been found at the bottom of the cliff, not far from where Louis fell. So was it a suicide or was it something else? The case becomes more and more complicated. So who is the killer? Dr. Allen wakes up from his sleep. He learns from the nurse that he has been sleepwalking. The nurse writes a prescription. Allen looked at the contents and saw that it was a recipe for poison. Then he suddenly had a wild guess. Ellen took the police to check the surveillance of the sleepwalking. Sure enough, he was obviously right-handed. He had written the prescription with his left hand, and Louis happened to be left-handed. He showed it to the expert, and it looked exactly the same as Louis' handwriting. Ellen guessed that the unconscious Louis had written the prescription and the warning letter by controlling the sleepwalking man. To test this idea, Ellen approached Louis' psychiatrist for answers, and he came up with a dangerous way to find out what was going on. He hooked up Alan's brain to the device. Then, through hypnosis, he connected Alan to Louis' brain waves. Sure enough, soon Alan spoke in Louis' voice about what had happened that day. The day of the picnic had been a pleasant one, but then Natalie and Steven got into a fight over a jar of sweets. The reason was that Steven wanted a piece of candy too, but Natalie was determined not to let him have it and was very aggressive. She said it was just for Louis. Stefan sensed something was wrong. He asked her if she had put something in it. The two of them started to fight over it. Louis was so frightened that he ran to the edge of the cliff alone. Stefan carries Louis away. Then he frantically asked Natalie why she was trying to hurt Louis. Before he could say anything else, he was pushed off the cliff by Natalie. And Louis, who witnessed this, knew that he was next, so he took a step backwards until he fell off the cliff. The truth finally comes out. But at that moment, Louis suddenly lost his vital signs in his hospital bed. All they could do was wake up Alan to save Louis. At that moment, everything that had happened to Louis since he was a child came back to him. It turns out that all of Louis' accidents were caused by his own mother, Natalie. She injected poison into the sweets to contaminate the food with bacteria. She deliberately turned on the power to the sockets. She had even left Louis as a baby untouched. But the question is, why did Natalie kill her own son? The psychologist explained she was suffering from a strange disease called Munchausen syndrome by proxy. The patient would abuse people, especially children, in exchange for love and attention. Now Steven is dead and Louis is in a persistent coma after being brought back to life. It's not that he can't wake up, it's that he doesn't want to. In his consciousness, his father is still watching over him in the form of a seaweed monster. It was his father, who was not related to him, who loved him more than his mother. All these years, it was because of Steven's presence Louis was able to survive his mother's constant torment. Now, they had both managed to escape Natalie's torment, but some were not so lucky. Soon after, Alan was divorced because of Natalie, and it was not so easy for him to escape Natalie. From that point on, Natalie was locked up in a mental hospital. It was clear that she had been pregnant for several months. As to whose baby it is, I don't have to tell you who it is, but you can guess. Finally, Munchausen syndrome by proxy is a real thing. The name of the disease comes from an 18th century German baron named Munchausen. He used to pretend to be sick to attract attention and to look the part. In 1851, the medical community first named the disease after him. Then came the development of Munchausen syndrome by proxy, often one of the most complex and deadly forms of maternal infliction on children. However, this psychological disorder does not only occur in parent-child relationships, but is not uncommon in life either, especially at work. Some people will make up stories about customers making things difficult for the company in order to get a promotion. Some will sow discord between colleagues. They then demonstrate their interpersonal skills by acting as mediators themselves, diffusing non-existent relationship crises. Others will refuse to help a colleague in difficulty so that they can act as a savior at a critical moment. If you have such a friend, you should stay away from him.